The U.S. is home to the world's highest diversity of salamander species, many of which are thought to be susceptible to a fungal pathogen known as Bsal. So far, scientists haven't detected it in North America, but many believe it's just a matter of time until it gets here, unless drastic action is taken. In response, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service imposed a ban on the trade of 201 salamander species in 2016. However, the recent discovery that frogs can also carry Bsal has led to an outcry from scientists, urging the government to ban the import of all salamander and frog species. My name is Mike DiGirolamo, your host for Mongabay Explores, a special podcast series about some of the most recent reporting from Mongabay.com's global team. Join me for a deeper discussion of one such project, where I'll explore issues with experts on the front lines of the looming salamander pandemic, to find out what we know now and what is being done to keep North America's and the world's salamanders safe. On this episode, I speak with Priya Nanjappa, who previously served as Program Manager for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and Tiffany Yap, who is a staff scientist at the Center for Biological Diversity. I spoke with them to learn about animal trade policy and the differences in the way the United States conducts this policy from other nations, and possibly worsens the risk of Bsal showing up here. Some of the things I learned were incredibly encouraging, and others surprised me a great deal. The scientific community has made great strides in helping to put policy in place to curb the spread of this pathogen, but if we want to make sure we keep imported animals from spreading diseases across borders into the United States and elsewhere, both Yap and Nanjappa say there is a lot more work left to be done. Can you state your name and the organization you work for?
My name is Priya Nanjappa. I'll conduct this interview more just as an independent citizen who's worked in this realm in my previous role with the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies.
How long have you been working on this particular problem or this potential pandemic threat?
Specifically on Bsal as the pandemic threat, basically since we learned about it, which was the first publication came out in 2013. And we began working on it right away, trying to figure out what was known about it in terms of its distribution, how widespread was it at that point, and then very quickly moving towards how do we keep it out of the United States and North America, because that was what became evident, was that it was not yet here.
And what were some of the things that you tried to get done within your organization or working with others?
Yeah, definitely. Pretty much everything I did, I have to say, was in partnership with others, but I was definitely in a central role in a lot of the work that was being done. In particular, we just began communicating about the issue. There were some folks within the U.S. Geological Survey that convened a meeting. I'm trying to remember if that happened in 2014 or 2015, but it was in fairly short order once that initial publication came out, which I believe was even towards the end of the year in 2013. And before that, I should step back a little bit, we began finding out what was possible in terms of the laws and regulations that were available to keep it out. And that was where I really learned that there was a major gap that was sitting out there. And there was a lot of conversations happening at the time as well about One Health, but that was talking about diseases that could be transmitted across from animals to humans. And as we all know, we've got mechanisms in place for when a disease impacts humans through the CDC, and there's ways in which they can help regulate, and there's authorities that they can exercise to prevent the threats and the pathways of movement to prevent the diseases that affect humans from spreading further. When it comes to animal health, more generally, we typically focus on agricultural animals, livestock and poultry, and to a certain extent aquaculture as well, so fish and shrimp, etc. There is the Animal Health Protection Act, which gives the U.S. Department of Agriculture the authority, and specifically the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, to examine what's coming in to the country or the potential pathways of spread of pathogens that could affect livestock and poultry. With that law in particular, there are other species of wildlife that can harbor pathogens that would impact livestock. There are ways in which to screen those other species of wildlife because of the pathogens that can impact livestock. But there is not a way to screen other wildlife that's generally in trade and moving in all sorts of pathways in and out of the country for a disease that only affects other wildlife.
In other words, if you import a salamander into the United States, there is no mandate to test it for Bcell. And this is the case for most wild imported animals, regarding most diseases that you would want to search for. I'm sorry to interrupt. This is the gap you're referring to, correct?
Exactly. And so that was what we identified. And we found that there were certain ways you could limit hosts of the pathogen through the injurious wildlife provisions of the Lacey Act, which is Title 18 of the Lacey Act. And we were able to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the authorized agency over the listings of injurious wildlife, to help move that forward. And we were very closely in communication with folks in Fish and Wildlife Service about what could be done, what the limitations were, and what our options were. And there had been an effort a few years prior to try to limit the importation of amphibians because of the sort of original amphibian chytrid fungus, which was affecting frogs worldwide and has contributed to the extinction of several species across the globe. But at that point, that fungal pathogen was known to exist in different strains thereof in North America and in the United States. And so that effort kind of fell flat. But in this case, we knew, or all the evidence had shown so far, that there was not any Bsal in the United States yet. And another aspect that kind of came out of all of these conversations and collaborations was that the U.S. Geological Survey and their Amphibian Research and Monitoring Initiative had been sampling for the original amphibian chytrid fungus, which is the Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis, or BD. They were able to reprocess those swabs to see if any Bsal would pop up. And so they started to do that. And they were also just doing new swabs, of certain species of salamanders in particular, since that was what, it seemed like this was focusing on. So all the evidence demonstrated that it was not here yet. So we talked to the Fish and Wildlife Service about how about in this case, we make it a purely preventative rule so that whatever got listed with respect to this threat of Bsal could not be imported into the United States and could not, move across state lines. And there's a little bit more nuance there in that there was like a legal battle that was underway at the time that later kind of changed our understanding of what the law was intended to do in that respect with respect to movement across state lines. But at least we knew that we could prevent animals from coming in that could be the more likely hosts of this pathogen. But the bottom line on all of that is that there was no way to just limit the pathogen and any potential pathway. That was the one pathway was through particularly identified hosts.
Tiffany Yap explains that while this measure limits carriers of Bsal into the United States, it doesn't stop all potential carriers, such as frogs, which have been known to carry it as well, citing the need for something more, such as a clean trade policy.
It's a little bit unconventional to use the Lacey Act that way because the thing about the Lacey Act is it is targeted towards wildlife that may become invasive and then therefore may hurt a lot of our agriculture or things like that. It doesn't really account for disease or viruses or fungi. And so with the Lacey Act, we kind of, instead of banning import of the fungus, we are banning the import of the carriers. But since then, we have found that other species of salamanders and some species of frogs can be carriers of Bsal. It's not really all-encompassing in terms of actually protecting the salamanders here from Bsal completely. But it is a big step, though, right? So they banned 201 species of salamanders from being imported here. And then they also started the Bsal task force that kind of does surveillance and monitoring and also testing to see what other species might be susceptible, what might be carriers, who might be the spreaders, things like that. Those are kind of some of the big action items that have happened. And that's specific to the US, but there are other places like in Europe, they also do a lot of surveillance and monitoring. There was also a call for a clean trade program, which has not happened yet, but we think is sorely needed because a lot of animals, amphibians, and many other kind of wildlife come in legally and they don't really get tested for any kind of disease. And so there isn't really any screening to make sure that the populations are healthy and that they're not bringing any kind of diseases in that might affect local native wildlife.
While the listing of the potential carriers of some 201 salamander species under the Lacey Act is a victory in and of itself, Priya also stressed that this is not a final solution.
again, the bigger picture on all of this is that we recognize is that's not the sharpest tool that we could have to prevent this from coming into the country. And what's really needed is something more of a comprehensive wildlife analog to that Animal Health Protection Act.
Can you tell me more about what that would look like?
Well, there were several of us that were talking about this at the time, and we did even draft some basic concepts within it, but it didn't get as much of the support as we were hoping from some of the groups that were trying to move it forward. There was definitely some interest within Congress, and we were talking to some of the folks on the Hill about this. But in general, the Animal Health Protection Act that protects our livestock and poultry, you have the ability to screen shipments that come in, and in some cases they have to have certifications coming from their country of origin regarding their health. But you can also screen animals when they come in, or if an outbreak is identified, which we've all seen, for example, if there's a salmonella outbreak or something else that is in the food chain, shipments stop, products that are on the shelves get removed and destroyed. And in some cases, again, with animals, they may actually cull or, destroy a portion of that group of animals in order to prevent the disease from spreading. So there would be a set of criteria, for kind of how you would determine which action you would take. But also, that would all have to start with the ability to quarantine and screen, potentially treat while in quarantine and then release back into the trade, or have some sort of certification that could be well regulated and inspected and periodically checked to ensure that, all the sort of everything was up to compliance and that there were appropriate measures in place. And right now, we have a lot of those facilities through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But in this case, what we were thinking would make a lot of sense is if there would be shared facilities with the Department of Interior and shared resources, including some of the veterinary staff that exist within the Department of Interior and the various agencies therein, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so that there could be a sharing of facilities to begin with, and perhaps over time, that capacity could grow. It would be dependent on how the funding would end up working with respect to appropriations or how that funding would get codified. And those were the sort of nitty-gritty details of the bill that we weren't directly working on, but just kind of thinking and looking at the models that were out there and talking to folks who were involved in APHIS, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, and, kind of understanding what happens. If you talk to people within USDA, they will say that they technically have some authority to do all this. But when you really think about it, if there was, let's say, a disease issue that was impacting livestock at the same time there was a disease issue that was only impacting other wildlife, and with no known nexus to human health, the likelihood of USDA spending resources to prevent the spread of a wildlife disease is pretty low. On the other hand, with the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular, and some of the other agencies therein, there would be a lot more direct authority over the ability to manage wildlife and the collaborations that already exist with state fish and wildlife agencies, which are really the primary authority over wildlife here in the United States. There's a lot more of that existing authority and collaboration, and all of that would be necessary. The existing authorities within the USDA, we sort of looked into it and believed that amendment to the Animal Health Protection Act would not be the way to go.
So how then could this difficult situation be addressed? One solution that Yap alluded to earlier was the option of a clean trade. Can you explain in basic terms for people what clean trade is?
So clean trade would be a program that kind of is set up so that animals being imported or exported first have to get tested to see if they have a certain disease. So say salamanders from Asia were being imported into the U.S. Either a clean trade program could require that the exporters in Asia test their animals and provide a certification saying that these animals are healthy and chytrid-free before being allowed to get imported into the U.S. Or they could get imported or when they get to the border, they would get quarantined and tested to make sure that they were clean. And then if they were clean, they would be allowed in.
And why don't we, the United States, have clean trade implemented for salamanders and amphibians?
That's a really good question. And I don't know that there's a really good answer for it. It does take more resources. Funding tends to be a constant concern and money tends to be a constant issue. But there's maybe not a lot of incentive for testing these animals, even though it's clear and the scientific community has shown and continues to find that these kinds of diseases are a constant threat to wildlife. It's not, for some reason, taken as seriously as it should be.
Nanjappa further elaborated on some of the roadblocks to implementing a clean trade. She also touched on what this looks like in nations other than the US and the differences in what is done in the United States. She further stressed again the need for additional wildlife law, and it could work in the US with proper facilities to take on the tasks needed, such as quarantining and testing animals at the border, and also giving the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service the authority to test for the fungus.
What we found is that in parts of Europe, their analogs to the Animal Health Protection Act for their livestock and other, food sources is also tied to the various veterinary protections that exist. So, for example, some of the requirements for us here for our pets to have rabies shots or, things like that go through a different division within the U.S. Department of Agriculture or state departments of agriculture, but it's separate from our food laws, but it's more connected to our food and the sort of veterinary provisions. In the U.S., those laws are connected, but are very separate for our wildlife-related laws and regulations, including the injurious wildlife provisions within the Lacey Act. In Europe, they're all kind of part of the same overarching legislation in most cases. And I think this is also true in Canada. So Canada was able to institute some more stricter regulations with respect to the import of salamanders, where they were able to restrict all salamanders and then make exceptions as needed depending on certain provisions. And one of those potential provisions could have been certification of health. The reason all that is important is that we do have these certifications of health for veterinary purposes. So like if you've heard about people moving overseas and needing to have their dog screened or quarantined or whatever, or have some sort of certificate from their veterinarian. Those are the laws that guide that is what has made some of those certifications possible with certain species that are pets in the pet trade or maybe in the food trade in other parts of the world. But we don't really do that with some of the wildlife species that come here for either food purposes or for pet trade because of that sort of separation that we have. And even though there's a World Health Organization and there's pathogens that have been identified there, and the USDA has the authority to screen for and sort of notify when that's observed, they don't really screen for the amphibian chytrid fungus, which is in this World Wildlife Health Organization's list. OIE is the European acronym. But the USDA does not screen for BD. It does not screen for Bsal, which has also been listed recently in that OIE notifiables list. That would be something that a wildlife law could give that authority to the Department of Interior or to the Fish and Wildlife Service in particular to screen for those notifiable pathogens because of this disconnect that we have, as I've been mentioning. So the clean trade, it could work if we had some of those different facilities and capacity, veterinary capacity, et cetera, able to handle that kind of quarantining, testing, et cetera. There's sort of two views. One is that you have the shipment of animals certified in advance by a veterinary authority that has been otherwise, deemed to be an appropriate authority or has received some sort of certification there, themselves. But so you could do it at that side. You could do it at the shipment, the origin side. But there's a lot of concern about how that would be actually handled in some parts of the world, especially in more developing countries or countries where there's kind of been more evidence of corruption or buying off authorities to get the appropriate permits you might need to make shipments happen. So that side, I think, is a little bit less trustworthy. If we could do some sort of screening and certification at the borders here, again, that would be where this law that I was describing before could come in handy. Then you could make a determination that a shipment was safe and move it forward. And this is like the type of thing that happens, very routinely with our food products that we bring into the U.S. and put out into the food system. The other thing would be moving within the U.S. So for those captive breeders, you could potentially create a certification program so that they could show that their whole facility, that they are breeding animals from, and raising animals from eggs and then shipping them are all healthy, they're free of disease, certain measures maybe that they would take, to ensure that everything was all clean and then ship them. That would create both an incentive for the buyer to look for certified clean pet stocks and for the pet providers or breeders to have this sort of clean facility and certification. And, in theory, could become sort of an economic incentive in itself. They could sort of charge a better price for a certified clean pet animal or that kind of thing. And so those are the two different sort of ways that whole clean trade concept could work. And again, we have all these analogs with our livestock and food systems.
Which could potentially solve the issue of a lack of an incentive that Yap had referred to. We could create it, but once again, it would require a new wildlife law. Which makes me wonder, with the increased awareness around wildlife diseases in general, might now be a time where such a law would receive more support.
I mean, I would hope so, because I think a lot of times it takes a lot. It takes a big, a societal realization moment or a political realization moment to realize that there are these things that we need to worry about that a lot of times we're okay, but it just takes one pandemic to see that it could be really bad, and we really need to do a better job in terms of biosecurity. Some really high percentage of diseases in humans, I think, comes from wildlife, something like 70% or something like that. And so it's kind of something we've known for a while, and it is surprising and frustrating and disappointing that we haven't upped our game in terms of biosecurity. I would hope that we kind of open our eyes again to see that there are many different ways that we can help keep people safe and wildlife safe. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but I do hope that we learn something from this. But to be honest, there have been other outbreaks, right? There was SARS, swine flu, things like that. Biosecurity never got ramped up. And so I don't know.
Nanjappa provides evidence of hope. At the very least, there is some legislative support, even if it's still not quite enough at the moment.
There was the HEROES Act that was just introduced in the House, actually has some language there about injurious species listings, or at least additional funding to be committed to injurious species listings, and has some additional language that I haven't even fully dug into. It just crossed my desk yesterday from a colleague of mine with whom I had worked with previously. And I do think exactly for the attention that this information is getting, some of the articles that have been published recently, that there is renewed interest, maybe to look into this. But I will say that just from the little that I looked into in that language, and again, I didn't dig into it in depth, it's still a Band-Aid. And what we really need is something more comprehensive.
It's clear that more aggressive policy is needed to stop Bsal from getting to North America. Trickier still is what to do when it arrives. You may recall this was the subject of my previous conversation with former Bcell Task Force Chair Dr. Jake Kirby. Yet Nanjappa provided some important context here, specifically in the case of Whitenose Syndrome, a fungal pathogen that kills bats, which made its way across the U.S. due to a number of factors that are alarmingly similar to how Bsal spreads. I was just going to ask you, and you kind of already answered this, what other avenues we could see the pathogen enter the U.S. other than just importing an animal directly, and you listed some of them. I wanted to see if there were any other hitches in the system that perhaps aren't being addressed.
Yeah, I mean, there's some trickier avenues for sure. For example, with Whitenose Syndrome, we don't know for certain, but where it was first detected, Whitenose Syndrome being the fungal pathogen that's affecting bats, and had been a really big issue in the northeastern U.S. or eastern U.S. in general, where bat populations began to crash. And now that pathogen has been detected out west in several states, and there's several other bat species in the west and southwest that could potentially be impacted, and that's still being sort of researched. But when that was first detected, it was in a cave that was high public use, and over time, as the information became clearer, we found that this pathogen already existed in Europe and probably had made its way through, and the bats that currently exist now are the ones that were able to, either naturally tolerate it, resist it, be not susceptible, or some genetics within the population allowed that to happen, and they were able to persist and recover, populations would recover. But we don't know for sure if there could have been species of bats, or at least I should say I don't know for sure, because I'm not a bat biologist, whether there were certain species that may have gone extinct in Europe, either before we knew it or before people were really kind of monitoring those types of things. So in that respect, the restriction of human activities or the ability to authorize or require, boot cleaning stations or things like that, those are the types of things I think that become really difficult and would involve a lot of the sort of social science aspects of epidemiology and thinking about, kind of how those factors come together. So I think those are the types of things and this was well studied with several other pathogens. How much do they move on the boots of our heels, or the heels of our boots? How much do they move on the mud on the foot of a duck or a deer? Is it potential that it could be spread in that way? How much do these pathogens move in the wind? And so all of those things have been discussed. At one point, I don't know what's been confirmed, but like with the Whitenose Syndrome jumping out west, there was quite a gap. It was sort of moving across state lines slowly, and there was like a wave of spread. And then all of a sudden it jumped over the Rockies and was found in Washington state. And so there was a lot of questions of how that happened. One theory that I don't know was ever confirmed is that cheeses are aged in caves, and some of those cheese shipments may have made their way out west. Who knows then from, the cheese shipments out west, then how that got into the wild in bats out west. But there's just all these different ways in which pathogens could land and potentially persist on substrates of various sorts and then get moved. So without kind of putting everybody and everything in bubbles, there's got to be a way to manage the most likely predominant pathways of spread, but then having the authority and ability to contain when an outbreak occurs.
On the National Park Service website, they confirmed that whitenose can be spread by humans from one location to another, by bats themselves, and touching the surfaces inside caves or mines where the fungus is present. So I asked Nanjappa to elaborate on what the implications are with Bsal.
Will admit I'm not up on the very latest on that bit of information, but from what I read at the time when those descriptions came out of the differences in the zoospores, or the spores, there's a zoospore and then there's this other, I'm trying to remember the term that they use, as like an encapsulated spore that had a thicker sort of outer covering and it could persist in the soils for some time.
That spore is an encysted non-motile spore, which can persist in water for at least a month, and in wet soil for 48 hours, and of course on amphibians themselves for several months.
So the problem there, and that's what we see with BD, the original chytrid fungus, is that once it's out there, it can persist for seasons, potentially. We don't fully understand, or at least I don't believe that we've fully cracked, why or how it persists in whether it's intermediate hosts or, soils and substrates or all of the above. But when the original BD fungal pathogen was affecting amphibians, in some of the places in the US where populations crashed, and so then they started captive breeding programs to replenish the populations and put them back out there. When they put them back out, they died because the pathogen was still present. That's the bigger problem when it comes to some of these wildlife diseases, is we can't control the movement of the animals. We can't control the movement of the water. You can't really go out and in one of our meetings, we had a guy from the DoD was kind of, involved in various natural resource activities that the Department of Defense does. And he was sort of jokingly saying, the second we find it on DoD lands, we're going to nuke it, and like literally nuke it. We're going to, but that, so, those extreme measures maybe could be possible on DoD lands, but maybe, not in your backyard pond, obviously, and even just the idea of sort of thinking about like dumping bleach all through a water system of some sort of a pond or otherwise, that's not really possible either. So what are the options? And there's been lots of different interesting studies that have been done where there are some measures that may help, more in the realm of probiotics, bacterial species that could have antifungal properties. And so then could you just sort of spray that out there and inoculate an area and thereby inoculate the frogs and maybe the soils and everything else, so that when it would come in contact with BD or Bcell, for that matter, depending on, what they found could be effective, then it could minimize the amount of transmission or the ability for that to persist in enough numbers to create another outbreak. But yeah, there's definitely a difficulty once the cat's out of the bag, especially in these big open wild systems. Containing becomes a lot harder.
Yap cautioned as well how difficult it would be to monitor traded goods that could potentially hold infected amphibians,
I mean, that's a tougher thing. I think in terms of global trade in general, with globalization and having all sorts of produce and all sorts of materials come from all over the world and being transported all over the world, you can get hitchhikers, frogs and salamanders and produce that might be coming from around the world, and they could be carriers. Those are potential pathways, but when it comes to trade, often it's in bulk, and so that kind of ups the risk. But, it just takes one, right? So in terms of other trade, there are ways that animals can kind of get in and be introduced to places through not pet trade, but still, or wildlife trade, but still getting across borders.
And we can't leave out the possibility of animals interacting with contaminated water.
If those spores are in water, a bird might go into the water, feed, bathe, whatever, and they leave, that those spores could stick to the bottom of their feet or to their feathers, and they could bring it to wherever they're going next. It's also been found to stay on snakeskin, so there hasn't been any kind of observations or reports of it spreading like that, but we do know from lab tests that the spores can last in water for quite some time. And so that's also a really big concern, because that means you may not realize that it's in the water, but it could be in the water and it could be spread that way.
So, taking all these pathways into account, it's even more crucial that whichever policy is implemented to stop the spread of Bcell, it will need to be fully comprehensive.
So stopping, quarantine, testing, treating, or, culling or otherwise removing that shipment from trade would be really important. And being able to do that with multiple pathways, and not just the host, but wherever the pathogen could be harbored. So in the water of a shipment of aquarium fish, or in the moss and leaves or whatever that might accompany plants or something that are moving into the country that might have been from a region where this disease has known to be, actively spreading. So those types of things, that would be the gist of it. But as part of all of that, it just would give the right agencies the authority to act, and ideally would also have some ability for the agencies to declare emergencies in ways that they could close areas or restrict activities or other types of actions that could help contribute to the reduction of spread.
Nanjappa also stressed the importance of the response plan drafted by the Bcell task force. But more than that, she specifically advocated that the time to prepare and act on this issue is now, not later when it arrives.
That is something that in general, I think we're also kind of seeing here. We've learned with the COVID pandemic that there were certain reports or plans and things that were put in place or that were available, but we didn't really take the steps to kind of understand and prepare, have those preparations ready. And that's the type of thing I think that could be done for Bsal if it hasn't been done already. And so that response plan is available on the Salamander fungus website. I believe it should still be there.
Both the strategic plan and the rapid response plan are currently available on salamanderfungus.org. I'd like to extend my gratitude to both Priya Nanjappa and Tiffany Yap for speaking with me and with Mongabay.com. Their contributions and their expertise are vital and greatly appreciated. I encourage you to listen to episodes 1 through 4 of Mongabay Explores to learn more about the history of Bcell, the hunt to identify it in the wild, and the efforts of the Bcell Task Force. I'd like to extend a hearty thanks to our podcast producer, Eric Hoffner, and also to Rhett Butler. Watch for a new edition of Mongabay Explores every 2 weeks, in between episodes of our flagship podcast, the Mongabay Newscast. Special projects like this are made possible by our Patreon supporters. Mongabay is a non-profit news provider, so we rely on the generosity of our listeners, readers, and friends. To add your support, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more. Keep up with all of Mongabay's news from Nature's Frontline at Mongabay.com, or get updates via Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay. Thank you once again, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Mongabay Explores.